Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks, and today we're going to be taking a look at Fuzz 101. So rewind to about 2005, and my old man very kindly bought me a Dennis Cornell Dallas Arbiter Fuzz Face from a Soho Soundhouse advert in the pages of Guitarist magazine. The pedal arrived, excitedly plugged in my Squier Affinity Telecaster and my 15-watt PV Rage, and was absolutely underwhelmed. I mean, I couldn't get any sound out of it initially. I don't think I had a battery in it, and I plugged it in backwards. But even once it was wired up correctly, the whole experience left me rather cold, to say the least. Resigned myself to the fact that I simply needed a better amp, and the pedal was consigned to the back of a cupboard, where it stayed for several years until I finally got my head around how to get the best out of it. Now, while the PV Rage may not be considered the ultimate pedal platform amp, the comments and questions that I get every time I feature a fuzz pedal on Friday Fretworks are anything to go by. This experience wasn't unique to me. Fuzz can be a frustrating, confusing minefield. So I thought today's video would be a good opportunity to try and answer some frequently asked questions about fuzz, take a look at some classic fuzz style circuits, how they sound, and ultimately how to get the best out of them. So the first thing worth understanding when it comes to fuzz is what type of tone are you going for, and in that respect it definitely helps to have at least a cursory or rudimentary understanding of the history of fuzz. As boring as that may sound, bear with me. Every year hundreds upon hundreds of new fuzz pedals are released claiming to be the best ever made, obviously, and it can be a little bit daunting to try and figure out which is the one for you. But if it helps narrow it down, know that, with a few notable exceptions, nearly every fuzz pedal ever released has its origins can be traced back to one of three pedals made between 1962 and 1969. The first of which we're going to look at in today's video is the Sola Sound Tonebender. Now, this was actually the British version of an American pedal, the Gibson Maestro Fuzz Tone. That was the first commercially produced fuzz pedal ever made, being released in 1962. Believe it or not, was initially marketed as a way to make your guitar sound like a woodwind instrument. Unsurprisingly, didn't prove particularly popular until 1965, when Keith Richards put one to incredible use on the Stones' mega hit Satisfaction, thus starting the fuzz pedal gold rush. With the Maestro Fuzz Tone in short supply, Gibson really were struggling to keep up with demand after Satisfaction was released, and exorbitant import taxes making it impractical for it to be sold in the UK. British designer Gary Hurst set about designing the Sola Sound Tonebender, which, at least initially, the Mark I was a very close copy of the Maestro Fuzz Tone. It was introduced in mid-1965 and by September of that year was being sold from Macari's in Denmark Street. It's commonly acknowledged that the first hit featuring a Tonebender was the Spencer Davis group Keep On Running, but arguably the most notable player of a Tonebender is of course Jimmy Page, who used one prolifically during his tenure with the Yardbirds and of course on Led Zeppelin 1.
I had this record at home of a guitar that had a lot of sustain on it, and I got him to come down and have a listen to it. I said, "Can you get that?" And he went away and came back with this phenomenal thing. A distortion pedal, which overloads the signal. Overdrive the sound and make it sound pretty rude.
It's aggressive, it's rude, it's anarchic, even still today, and if you've never played a fuzz pedal before, can be particularly unforgiving. It's totally unrelenting. Now for today's video, I'm going to be using the Jackson Audio Fuzz, which, aside from being a fantastic sounding fuzz pedal, serves the purposes of today's video particularly well in that it's modular. It's pretty unique in that respect, in that you can switch out integral parts of the pedal circuitry for different modules that recreate different famous fuzz circuits. Now for the next clip, needless to say, I'm going to be using the Fuzz Page Mark II module, which, as the name suggests, brilliantly recreates that Tonebender Mark II that Jimmy Page was so famous for using. Next up in this video, and chronologically, is arguably one of the most instantly recognisable pieces of guitar gear ever created, being based off the bottom of a microphone stand, believe it or not, as of course the Dallas Arbiter Fuzz Face. Released and designed in 1966 by Ivor Arbiter, coincidentally the man who also designed the Drop T Beatles logo, it's a bit of trivia for you, was initially a very close copy of a Tonebender Mark 1.5, something Ivor Arbiter kind of cheekily referred to in the Fuzz Face manual, where he coined it a tone-bending unit. Now, despite being very close in terms of circuitry, one or two different key components meant that the Fuzz Face had a very unique sound. Fatter low end and a thicker, more kind of velvety fuzz. The Fuzz Face was near enough an instant success, with one particularly notable early adopter, of course, being Jimi Hendrix, who was seen using one as early as November of 1966 on stage in Germany, presumably having picked it up a few weeks prior in London. Of course, the pedal was only released in mid-1966. As I said earlier, I've always struggled somewhat with the sound of a Fuzz Face running into a clean amp. For me, at least personally, with any type of headroom, it just feels particularly uninspiring under the fingers, which makes sense when you see that Jimi Hendrix was of course running his into an already cranked Marshall that was already moving some air. You can simulate this by running an overdrive pedal after a fuzz pedal, or you can simply run it into an already cranked amp. Either way, it's an incredibly cool sound that I find particularly inspiring, and is a sound that I get a hell of a lot of use out of, both on stage and in the studio. Now for this next clip, I'm going to be using the Fuzz Classic Vintage module in the Jackson, and then stacking it with an original 90s Marshall Bluesbreaker, as I said, to simulate the sound of a driven amp. Last, but definitely not least, is arguably the most storied of the three fuzz pedals that we're going to talk about today. And that is, of course, the Electro-Harmonix Big Muff, designed and introduced in 1969 by Mike Matthews and his business partner Bob Meyer. The first iteration of the Big Muff, the Pi, known colloquially as the Triangle, was actually very heavily based on a prior pedal that Mike had designed called the Foxy Lady whilst working under contract for Guild. Over the next 50 years or so, there were to be as many as 9 different iterations of the Big Muff, and although they were said to vary from pedal to pedal and from model to model, the core sound principally remained. Scoop mids and a thick, woolly, violin-esque sustaining fuzz that, interestingly, Electro-Harmonix actually characterised as more of a distortion. Now, because of these scoop mids, the Big Muff is incredibly dependent on what amp you are running it into. If you run it into a clean-style Fender amp, inherently quite mid-scooped anyway, you're going to get a big, thick wall of fuzz with incredibly pronounced high end and low end. If you run it into a Marshall, you're going to get a more mid-focus sound that's more typically kind of associated with David Gilmour's sound, as opposed to maybe the Smashing Pumpkins Cherub Rock if you run it into a clean Fender amp. Now for this next clip, I'm going to be using the Goat Head module for the Jackson Audio Fuzz, and at the start I'm actually going to flick between a Fender style amp emulation and then into the Marshall style amp to give you an idea of the difference between the two. So there you have it. Now, of course, there are more than 3 fuzz-style circuits, and this video is far from comprehensive. As I said, there are new fuzz pedals released every single year, all professing to be the latest and greatest. But, as I said, it can be a little bit of a minefield, so hopefully this video will at least serve to give you a better, more comprehensive understanding as to what the fuzz pedal that you're considering may be based on. As I said, it's not comprehensive, but hopefully will give you a nudge in the right direction. I'm going to play you out now with one of my favourite Fuzz Face style circuits, which, somewhat sacrilegiously, is actually the Smiley Fuzz, I think it's called, a Fuzz Face style emulation within Logic Pro's pedal board. Who knows? I never said I was a purist. As ever, I'm Chris Buck. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next week for another episode of Friday Fretworks.